I'm Andy McNeil, and this is Free Arkansas. And I'm excited today to have Representative David Ray here to talk to us. David, how are you doing?
I'm great, Andy. Thanks for inviting me to join the conversation with you.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everything that you do. We're doing at the State House. And I can tell by, I've got sitting on my other screen here a list of all the bills that we had mentioned that you were involved with. And it is a giant list. So I didn't count it, but it's a really big list. And so you must have been extremely busy. But before you tell me about that, I know you've been around politics for a while. Have you always liked politics?
Well, I've liked politics since a fairly young age. I was in, not to tell you exactly how old I am, but I was in high school when 9/11 took place.
Okay.
And for an entire generation of Americans, that was a really formative event. And that was when I really started paying attention and reading the news and trying to figure out what was going on. And there were a lot of other issues in the news around that time. The early 2000s brought us the Bush tax cuts, and that was something that I became interested in and sort of sparked my interest in tax and fiscal policy. And yes, I've been interested in politics from an early age, and I know that makes me a little bit strange compared to most people. But it really led me into helping work to elect people that shared my values and beliefs. So I spent the last 20 years or so professionally, working to help elect people that share similar values and beliefs to mine. I've been a communications director for Senator Tom Cotton when he ran for the U.S. Senate. I've managed both of Attorney General Tim Griffin's campaigns for AG and worked with the state Republican Party for a while, and many other roles as well. So it's been something I've been involved in for a long time. I never really saw myself as a candidate per se, just as somebody that was a helper. But in 2019, at the time, I was chief of staff for Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin. He was lieutenant governor at the time. And when you're in that role, you get a pretty up close seat to the legislative process. And that year, I think the legislature, with a Republican supermajority and with a several $100 million surplus, raised, I think, 6 different taxes. And I'm just sitting here shaking my head. And I thought, maybe I should throw my hat in the ring.
It's time for action.
And so that's what I did. And, I'm not taking the credit for it per se, but since I've been elected, I don't believe we passed a single tax increase through the legislature. So I'm proud of that.
Well, one of the things that I sort of think is, and I've mentioned these to you before, so often I think people get caught up with the culture war. They get a lot more attention that way. They're in the media a lot more, but so often it's the boring stuff, that really effectuates change. And so one of the things that I care about the state is, how do we create prosperity? I believe we're in an arms race for jobs. So how do we create the right jobs? And part of that formula, and that we could debate what this is exactly, but is the right amount of taxation, the right amount of regulation, the right amount of, access to healthcare and good schools and safety, and I think these things attract jobs. But I also, like I said, I think taxation is one of the big ones. And so I have this impression that you're doing a lot of that work by looking at some of the bills that you did around taxation. Do you have a view about, this is how I generally think about how taxation, drives our society in one way or the other?
Yeah, definitely. I want to circle back first to one thing you said, that a phrase that really I like and caught my attention, which is an arms race for jobs. That is truly the way I view it. Our society is more mobile than ever before. People do not have to live in a certain place their whole life. They have mobility. The pandemic really accelerated a lot of that mobility. And so we're in a competition every single day with every state in the country and even internationally for new movers, for capital, for jobs, and all of this stuff. So I sort of start on tax stuff, and I think, there's a whole, cornucopia, to use
There
a
it is.
Thanksgiving word. We got Thanksgiving coming up
Right.
soon. Of factors that impact competitiveness, economic competitiveness, but tax policy is a big one.
Right.
And you can really ruin a state if you have really poor tax policy. And so the way I approach it from a 10,000 foot level is I start from the premise that all taxes are economically damaging to some extent, but some taxes are more economically damaging than others. And from my vantage point, income tax, and capital gains is part of income tax, but income
Right.
tax is the worst, um, because the most basic rule of human behavior is if you want more of something, you incentivize it. If you want less of something, you penalize it. I mean, anybody who's ever raised small children understands those types of incentives. I have an
Yes.
8-year-old and a 5-year-old, but what the income tax penalizes is work and labor and productivity. And these are all things that we want more of as a society, not less of. And so, when we started this journey in 2013, um, when we had a state income tax of 7%.
Yeah.
It stuck out like a sore thumb. We were the highest in the Southeast. We were one of the highest in the country. And when Governor Hutchinson took office, he made cutting the state income tax a priority of his. And during his time in office, we went from 7% down to 4.9%. And during Governor Sanders' first term, we've gone from 4.9 down to 3.9. So we're in a much, much more competitive place today than we were, 11 years ago at the start of this. But we still have a long way to go.
Yep.
I'm one of the people that would like to see us eventually get to zero and phase the income tax out entirely. That's a pretty big, audacious goal, and it's not going to be easily realized or achieved. And if we do achieve it, it's going to take quite a bit of time. But
Right.
but you have to have a North Star. You have to have a goal that you're shooting for, and that's one of my main goals from a tax standpoint. Is I would love for us to be one of the states like Texas, like Tennessee, like Florida, Nevada, and others where we don't penalize work. You can work as much as you want and keep the fruits of your labor.
Yeah. And I actually agree with this. But let's kind of go down the rabbit hole for a second, because so often, like for example, when we raise money for some of our businesses, and we've raised hundreds of millions of dollars, generally you're raising it from out of state sources. They show up in Arkansas. They have conclusions about what they think about the state. And a lot of times you're just looking at a list, right? Like, where does healthcare stand, or where does education stand? And so we might dismiss these things, but they can be very important. So I think for sure taxes are one of them. So I'm in the process of actually writing this book. And I agree with you. I think that our income tax should be zero. And I think that because I just look at the flight of capital and jobs and people that are moving to places like Texas and Florida. And I think that almost that by itself is a good basis. But here in Arkansas, if we just just to think that the revenue that we're generating, we actually needed to spend. So let's not worry about the spend side for a second. My math is that the 3.9% generates about $3.5 billion in revenue for the state. What would be your idea about where we would switch that to? We switch it to sales tax, income tax, fees of other kinds. What would you do?
Yeah, so there's two ways to answer that. One would be if I were starting a state from scratch, what would I
Yeah.
do? And the other is, given the system that we have now, what would I do? If I were starting a state from scratch, I would start with zero income tax, and then you wouldn't have to eliminate it.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and you would lean more heavily on consumption taxes, right?
Right.
Um, that is, those are probably the least damaging economically of all taxes. Certainly, your economy to a good extent it needs a lot of consumption, but you also need people to save and
Right.
invest, and you need them to donate to charities and things of that nature. So you really don't want people consuming all that they have. You want them saving for retirement and doing all sorts of other things as well. So putting some sort, if you have to raise revenue, consumption taxes are not a bad way to do it. Now, how would we do this in Arkansas? So you mentioned our state income tax currently does generate around $3 billion a year. The good news is, over the last 11 years, we've reduced the amount of income tax by over 1.5 billion. So
Yeah.
we have reduced a really extraordinary amount, and that number may sound sort of hypothetical to people, but when you break down what it means for a normal family, um, I had actually some accountants do the math for me on this recently, over at the UCA Center for Economics. They estimate that for um, a family on two starting teacher salaries, they are saving an estimated $1,800 a year each and every year, just as a result of the state income taxes we've passed going back to 2013.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of money. That's Christmas presents for your family. That's a car repair that you weren't expecting. That's a doctor's medical bill that you weren't expecting. So that's real money for real families. And so, I would just say three quick steps. Number one, if we're enacting pro-growth policies, our economy is going to continue to grow. And so, as lawmakers, we have to be disciplined and not just spend every extra dollar that comes in as our economy grows. We have to dedicate a significant portion of increased revenue to lowering rates and returning that savings to the taxpayers. So that's step number one. As you grow, instead of just automatically spending the new money you get, you got to be disciplined and continually reduce your rates. Step number two is you've got to tackle spending. And when people say you got to cut spending, what they typically think about are programmatic cuts. They think, oh, you're going to kick people off this program or that program. But what people don't realize is there's so many opportunity for savings in state governments. Just look at shared services, things like vehicle fleet management, real estate footprint, technology and IT, employee benefits. I like to use the example, the state of Tennessee. They really, about 10 or 12 years ago, got really purposeful about how they were managing their state's real estate footprint.
Yeah.
State governments own tons of real estate.
Bunch of real estate.
But they weren't very focused about how they were managing it. They created a very small department of only about a dozen employees that all came from the private sector. And they got really purposeful about reducing and optimizing their state's real estate footprint. After about 8 years of this agency being in existence, they had realized $65 million per year, in annualized savings. If we were able to do something like that, we could go in and overnight eliminate like the franchise tax on small businesses. The third step I really think is eventually when you get the rate really low, once you get a rate like below 2%, it's going to become really tough sledding from there. And I think you got to go in and take a look at a lot of the loopholes and carve outs in the tax code. A lot of these incentives that we have and subsidies that we do for certain industries. And, I favor a tax code with a broad base and low rates that treats taxpayers as neutrally as possible, doesn't do a lot of, picking winners and losers and putting the thumb on the scale for this industry or that industry. And currently, I would say of the three steps that I think are necessary to phase out our income tax, we're really only doing the first one.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of room to improve, I think.
Well, okay, you've given me a lot to lean in. I'm going to jump around these ones for a second. Let's start on the growth policies because I'm just curious. I've got a couple ideas here, and that I'll throw at you. But I'd like to, I do want to say this. I think that I thought Asa did a good job in promoting business within the state, and I think it's one area too where Governor Sanders has done a good job as well. but it doesn't mean that we can't do better. So a lot of times I look no further than like Abilene, Texas, where they've got that $100 billion, Stargate project with, OpenAI and Oracle and a couple other different funds. So I'm curious, tell me some of the things that you're hearing about pro-growth policies that you like or would like to promote.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have observed recently, just with our neighbors to the north in Missouri, is they went in and eliminated their capital gains tax.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of anything that is, I mean, there's very few policies that are more pro-growth than eliminating your capital gains tax. In Arkansas, it's really not that big of a revenue hit to the state. And I think it would be made even smaller when you factor in the economic growth that we would experience because of it. And you know, I understand there's people that don't agree with me on this, and they have, sort of fairness and equity reasons for not wanting to go this route. But the reality is that in virtually every instance, capital gains is double taxation. You know, any investment that you purchased was very likely at one point made with money that you paid taxes on as ordinary income. So I view it as a really unfair tax.
Yeah.
So that's one off the top of my head.
Well, I here's another one. But before I say that, I do think that taxation policy, when we think about, let's say, the most at-risk people, from an economic perspective, which is a huge percentage. I mean, I heard the Secretary of Commerce the other day make this quote. I don't know where he got the data, but he said last year was the biggest amount of Americans who went to Europe on a vacation, but also it was the biggest in terms of food assistance. And I can tell from like just our Manor House here in Russellville, talking to the pastor that runs that the other day, he was telling me they've seen a lot more people than they've seen before in terms of number of families. So I know people are hurting at the bottom level. I think that, we'd always want to be mindful of that. But I don't know that in a lot of ways, they're probably not paying a tax anyway. At some level down, they're not really having to pay the income tax. But let me go back to the growth for a second, because another idea that I think we should consider, this is another thing that I'd love to promote, and you can freely steal this idea, David. You can just take it and run with it. Delaware creates about a third of its revenue through fees associated with putting your companies there. And so lots of companies, including ones that I have, although I don't always do this, I put it in Delaware. And the reason is they have a business chancery court, and you just know when you get there, and then the shines off the dog a little bit because Texas is copying this, and in order to lure people away, they're just besmirching the guys in Delaware. But the idea is, if I have a business contract between you and me, and I can go to a judge that's really business minded, that I can know that's going to be fair. What I don't want to have happen is you and I are arguing about a complex contract, and I'm going in front of a guy that does DUIs 1 minute, divorces the next second, and then all of a sudden he's going to look at this complex business transaction. So I think setting up business chancery court and attracting companies to keep their headquarters here, from a registration perspective, is another way to drive growth and change, inside.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, and it kind of made me think of our tax appeals commission, which we created a few years ago, which has been a really good thing for our taxpayers. Previously, if you had a dispute with DF&A over what you owed, and they ruled against you, you could appeal that decision back to DF&A. And so it was kind of like the fox guarding the hen house. Like, the taxpayers almost never prevailed on an appeal. But since we've created this independent tax appeals commission, it's been a lot better results, I think, for those sorts of tax disputes. The other thing you mentioned that really stuck out to me is you were talking about how, on the one end, more European vacations than ever before, but also,
right,
people visiting food pantries. I think it is important, and I should have mentioned this at the outset. It is important to pair a pro-growth agenda with an agenda of affordability, because we do have what, I hate to even say this, because the most overused word in all of politics, and it annoys me when other people say it, is crisis. They say everything is a crisis, but I truly do feel like we are experiencing an affordability crisis in America, and especially in areas like housing, in groceries, it is causing people when you see these polls that say X percent or Y percent of Americans no longer believe the American dream is attainable, I think affordability and policies around affordability have a lot to do with that.
Oh,
So we have to work really hard on that too.
yeah. I mean, I live in Yell County, Arkansas, and in Yell County, it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people are on Medicaid. When you look at the Dardanelle school system, especially at the younger ages, the number of people that are on the lunch program is pretty substantial. It's a clear majority. Now we can be cynical about that, and we can say, "Hey, that's because because the system is rewarding." You walk in the front door, here's your form to fill out, but there's got to, like it's still an issue we got to deal with, and so to me, when I look at doing this, it's getting this balance right is really important. So the way that I think that, and I'm just curious how you would think you would do this. So I applaud moving the tax number down, and this year we had a surplus, I think, of a few $100 million.
Yeah,
I
think it was like 365 million in surplus.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. The growth makes a lot of sense, eliminating loopholes, and then smart policies about, let's go after the right businesses, let's set up the right, incentives so they can get here. But would you favor a system where what it did is maybe it ramped off of the income tax and ramped up as, let's say, something like a property tax? Or
Yeah.
would you put part of it in a use tax?
Well, property taxes might be the most hated tax
Yes.
of all of people that I talk to, and in terms of ranking my prioritization, I would probably target the income tax first. But the other reason that I target the income tax above the property tax is because in almost every state, and certainly in Arkansas, property tax is a local tax, and our system is the way our system is built. That's what funds local governments.
Right.
Now, I do have some ideas on things we can do on property tax, because that wraps into the affordability conversation.
All right. Tell me about that.
Well, our approach to so one thing that I did really early on when I was first elected, actually one of the first bills I ever attempted to run, was a bill that I call special election reform. It's basically election consolidation. So you have a lot of local measures and questions, people wanting to raise this this millage for the school, or this millage for the library, or raise 1/4 cent sales tax to build a county jail or something like that. And what they would do historically is local governments would basically play hide the ball with these things.
Right.
They'd put them on random dates in the middle of February when nobody knew it was going on. And then you'd have 6% turnout, and surprise, your property taxes just went up. So I didn't get that passed my first term. It failed by 6 votes, but I got it passed my second term. And so I think that is helping slow the growth in property taxes, because the statistics just show that when you put these things on either the primary date or the general election date, the voters are much more discerning about what they're willing to approve. When you have 5% turnout on a special election date, it's totally random what you get, and they pass much more frequently. The other lever on property tax that we've utilized recently is the homestead tax credit, and that's good for primary residences. It used to be, I think, $350. We've now raised it up to $600, which is real savings for people. But one thing that I'm working on for next session, and I've never introduced this before, if you drill down and ask me a bunch of details about it, I'm going to have to say I'm working on it.
Okay.
But it's a policy known as truth-in-taxation, and it's been adopted in Utah and I believe Kansas and just a handful of states. But as you know, there's two levers on property tax. There's the rate, which is the millage, and then there's the assessment. There's the value of the property. And I think what gets people so frustrated about property tax is when their valuation is done, when their assessment's done and the valuation goes up, their tax bill goes up. And so even though their rate never went up, they're paying more. So it feels like they got a property tax increase. The way truth in taxation works and by the way, this has resulted in politicians trying to put all sorts of restrictions on the assessment process and all that. What truth in taxation does is it says, hey, we want your assessments to be market based. Assess the property for the value of the property. Don't put all these arbitrary restrictions on that. But if your assessment results in a higher tax bill, you then have to adjust your millage rate so that it's revenue neutral. And if the government, if the taxing entity, the school district or the county or the city, if they want to raise additional revenue, they need to go in and raise the rate and make the case to the voters in an election why the rate needs to be increased.
I actually don't dislike what you just said. I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that, here are like my property taxes is, I mean, it's not relative to other places. It's low. So like I've had places in other states where I've owned property and where I've had super high taxes where I just know I'm going to get this crazy bill. Now in Texas, I know it because I'm not going to pay income tax if I'm there. I mean, I'm not a resident there, but if I was, I would know, I knew that it was getting it through property tax. Didn't necessarily like that. So I do like the whole idea of like your total taxation, income tax, property tax, even the small little hidden things, fuel tax, etc., being driven down. But I do think I like also the idea of the simplicity of not having to fill out an income tax form, because a property tax form is easier to deal with. You get a bill, you walk out and pay it, right? But I do agree with you for the things that you said, related to that. And so it'll be interesting. I just think it will attract more people to the state. But we've done a good job so far. Let me switch gears and ask you a different question. So I love the idea of direct democracy. I like the idea that we could put an amendment in front of the voters. And I found it really interesting over the last number of years that lots of different politicians, especially people in the state house, have been trying to put rules in place to make that harder, right? More signatures, more counties. Last time somebody had a one that said it has to be 50% of the, registered voters. And we went back and looked at everything that's ever passed, and almost nothing would have passed if you had passed that. Like, you might as well just eliminate the amendment process. And so I've loved these different debates. Are you somebody that, wants to make it harder for people like me to like put an amendment on?
So here's where I would start on that discussion. About half the states in America have the initiative and referendum process, and about half don't. So it's about 50-50. Arkansas has it in its state constitution. It's been there for some time. So, I don't view this so much as a debate about should we have this process or should we not have this process, because we have it. And we're not in if we were in one of the states that didn't have it, we could have a very interesting discussion about the pros and cons of adopting it.
Right.
I personally think representative democracy is the best form of government on the planet. And, this system of initiative was not handed down to us by our founding fathers. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson didn't come up with this thing. It came to us from Europe. It started in Switzerland. And came over as a progressive era reform. But the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, today we have this process. It's not going away. So what should it look like? And what guardrails should it have? So I start from the premise that as a conservative, I'm very concerned about election integrity. And I think everybody should be concerned about election integrity, not just Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, vegetarians, anybody. But if we're concerned about the integrity of an election in which your state representative is chosen or your governor or your congressman is chosen, I think we have to be just as concerned about the integrity of an election in which we amend our state constitution or we pass new laws through an initiated act. And so when you look at the current process, I don't think the current process is yielding some really alarming results. For example, duplicate signatures. If you go back over the last several election cycles, pretty much any issue that has been turned in has had between 5 to 10% duplicate signatures. That's That's not all invalid. That's just duplicates. That's people signing multiple times. Then you look at just signatures that are invalid for any reason, right? Because somebody from Texas that was over here at a festival signed it, or somebody that was ineligible to vote signed it, or what have you. The invalid rate overall on all these measures going back over the last 10 or 12 years has ranged anywhere from 20% to 35% in a lot of instances. If we did an audit of an election in which I was on the ballot or anybody, any other elected official, and we found that 30% of those votes were cast by people who were ineligible to participate, we would be truly alarmed. And so I just think this process would benefit from some well thought out guardrails, some things that made it a little bit less Wild West and a little bit more orderly. And so that's been my approach. Other people might have had different approaches, and some people don't believe me when I say this, but a lot of the things that I have introduced, I have done with the goal of not trying to make the process harder per se, but trying to improve it, trying to make it better. Now, people are free to disagree on what they think makes it better or worse, but that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at it from.
Well, like if that's the big worry, I got two things to say on that. So first on voter integrity, one of the things I find really, really interesting. So I have a good friend that I was involved with politics way, way back, decades ago, back in the 90s. His name's Hans von Spakovsky. He's one of the directors at Heritage in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
he was on the election. If you've met Hans?
Yes.
So he's been the one that's writing all the election, on the voting. He's the one that's advocating that. He sends me his books when he does it. Interestingly, though, when I get in a conversation with somebody, like even Hans after Biden won, he wrote a book, and I happened to say to some friends of mine, I happened to say something like, yeah, no one at Heritage thinks the whole thing was stolen. And I walked into this buzzsaw for friends of mine that wanted to tell me otherwise. But what I was trying to tell them was like, look, when Hans writes about voter problems, he's not writing about it in the way that people articulate it. People are hyperbolic about this in a lot of ways. So like one of the things that I would say is like when I ask people like, do you think in Yell County, Arkansas, there's a bunch of cheating? And most people would say like, no, they're just not. Like I've never looked at any of our elections and say that. My other thing I would say that is that if you wanted to do that process, we get a lot of ways. Like I sign all legal contracts mostly through DocuSign, right? I've got to go get a real ID. Certainly there could be a process that made it a little simpler. I sometimes am cynical about this because, like even when we look at this year, and I can't prove what I'm about to say, so this is just my cynicism coming out, and this might not be true. So, but when they had the amendment related to the reversal of the casino, I don't think anybody paid much attention to that down at the State House. I can't, they did not give it the same rigor as they did around the abortion one and the marijuana one. And the reason is they don't want those. So my guess is they were all over those two. But the ones that, for the other one, so I felt like it was like, double standards. So I would like it to be cleaned up. I just like the idea as a voter of being able to affect change. And so oftentimes what people do, and I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, here in Arkansas, somebody will say to me, like, they don't like what the policies are. And I just sit there and go like, well, I mean, we did term limits this way. We voted for improving the highways this way. And this year we're going to put a big growth initiative on there, right? You guys passed we're doing that's one of the amendments, right?
Yeah, there's an economic development type amendment.
And did you vote for that? You want to see that pass, right?
I did not vote for it. No,
you did not vote for it. Okay, because how does it work down there? You guys can put 3 things on the ballot. Is that right?
Yeah, typically the House has the option to refer one measure per cycle out to the voters. The Senate has the option to refer one option or one issue out to the voters, and then the rules are a little hazy on how you come up with a third, but generally, if there's consensus between the 2 chambers on a third idea, then we have the option of doing a third. We don't have to refer any out,
right?
And so that's always an option. But I referred one out, or I had one that was referred out. The House,
Which one was that?
the citizen only voting amendment,
Okay.
will be on the 2026 ballot, and that's the one that I passed, or that's the one that I introduced that was passed out of the House.
Yeah. And so like, and I'm just sort of leaning into this a little bit, David, but like, so you would worry that like, if I thought that was a good idea and I went around the state, that I perhaps was collecting out of state signatures, people duplicating it, and that there wasn't the methodology to actually ensure that those signatures are Arkansans, even though if it got on the ballot and voted for, it would be voted for Arkansans, assuming that we believe the voting process works.
Yeah, I still think if you had a problematic petition process, that would be highly problematic, because that's part of the process. That would be like saying, well, I mean, who cares if the bill got out of committee on a proper vote? The full House and the full Senate ultimately approved it. No, the process matters. You have to follow the rules, and the petition process is just one of the areas that I think is susceptible to abuse with the initiative process. Another is the ballot title itself. Thankfully we have a ballot title review process that's been in Arkansas for 65 years. It was briefly changed and moved over to the State Board of Elections, and the Supreme Court struck that down and said it was unconstitutional. So I ran the legislation to basically put it back in place. But you have to have a stringent ballot title review process, because otherwise, it opens the door to voters just being duped or easily misled with, ballot title language that is deceiving, that is, misleading, things of that nature. And so that's not good for voters.
I've got one other little piece on this, and I'll just be quiet. We can switch gears. Here in Polk County, my guess is, it's just my personal guess. My guess is that if you put it on the ballot to be wet, this county would turn wet. That would pass. But what we've got is this crazy rule that was put in place back, I think, in the 80s, where you've got to collect like 37 or 38% of registered voters. And I promise you that one, I mean, you could make this claim that like there's all this stuff that's inappropriate, but the opposition would for sure hire lawyers to ensure those signatures were correct. This would be a fight in Polk County. Not a big fight, but it would be a fight, and
that's
so
a very high. That's a very high threshold.
Oh, it's crazy. That's it's 38%. It's almost impossible.
It's not impossible, but it's close to impossible to reach.
Yeah, because if you get 38%, like they did in Benton County, if they've done they got up in Yellville, they passed it. I mean, it'll pass because, I mean, we almost never get that many voters showing up, right? Like, in an election. So anyway, David, I really appreciate all that you do. I mean, keep up the good work of like this yeoman's work of taxation, and it looks like it's a lot of other things that are regulations, et cetera, growth things. And so, thank you for taking your time and serving. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it. I tell people I enjoy it most days. But that's any job, right?
Of course. Yes.
Everybody has bad days, but I really do enjoy just being a part of the conversation about how to solve problems, how to try and make our state a jobs magnet, how to improve our economic competitiveness, because it's like you alluded to with the arms race comment, every single day in the world of economic competitiveness, we are either moving forward or we're falling behind. There is no such thing as sitting still. If you just this year alone in 2025, there's been 11 different states that have cut their income tax. We have not.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yep. We have not. So that means that in 2025, just on that one measure of income tax, we have fallen behind. Now, I do feel pretty good about the chances that we come in, early next year, maybe in a special session or in conjunction with the fiscal session, and we do some more income tax relief. Certainly, having ended the 2025 fiscal year with a $365 million surplus, I think we have to. We absolutely have to. And I think we need to come in and cut, whether it's 3/10 or 4/10 or 5/10, or whatever the numbers balance out to. We've got to do that, because otherwise you're going around the track and there's other cars that are trying to lap you every single day.
Yeah, there's no question that your point is well taken. I mean, the reality is that if we look at where we are and we can imagine 20 years, if there's, I say this about Russellville a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I'll say, I don't know how many 25,000 person towns there are in the United States, but I know this for sure. If we could go out into the future and look back, what's going to happen is some of them are going to be very prosperous. The land values will go up. There'll be growth. There'll be all these positive things. And some of them will go the other way. And it'll really come down to one thing, and that is the leadership, and what the policies that they put in place and how they led. So I think it can be the unlocking boot. So, that's why I say keep up the good work.
No, thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Appreciate your time, David. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me on your podcast and for engaging in the conversation with me.